The chamber goes silent the moment the final number appears above the floor. 412 votes for banishment. Only 60 against. I am one of the 60. And right now that fact feels like it means nothing at all. My name is Viserion Thale, and I sit on the outer ring of the compact assembly, representing the water world of Andrai. I have spent 11 years in this chamber. I have watched wars get approved with less debate than the argument we just had about a single species that never once broke a treaty. Yet here we are. Earth is gone. Not destroyed. Worse than that. Erased from every record, every trade route, every alliance that took decades to build. The human ambassador stands at the podium, and I expect her to shout. I expect tears, or anger, or some final desperate plea for mercy. Her name is Grace Whitmore, and I have negotiated across the table from her a dozen times. She has always been calm, always precise, always the one who finds the smallest gap in an argument and pulls it apart thread by thread. Today, she is calmer than I have ever seen her. She asks for the floor one last time. The speaker, eager to close this shameful chapter and move to the next agenda item, waves a hand and tells her she has 30 seconds. She does not need 30 seconds. She says humanity accepts the vote. She says her people will leave compact space within the week, as required. Then she says something that will replay in my mind for the rest of my life. She says humanity will make its rules clear. Nobody in the chamber reacts. A few delegates chuckle. The speaker taps his console and calls for the next item on the agenda, as if nothing important just happened. I watch Grace Whitmore walk out of the chamber with her spine straight and her chin level, and I feel a cold weight settle into my chest that I cannot explain. I try to tell myself it is nothing. Humanity has no fleet worth mentioning, compared to the Compact's combined forces. Their entire military budget, according to the last transparency report they filed, would not cover the fuel costs of a single Compact battle group for a month. They have no allies left to call on, because we just voted to strip every alliance they had. What rules could they possibly make clear to anyone? I leave the chamber and walk the long glass corridor that overlooks the station's central garden, a place built to remind delegates from 100 different worlds of something green and living, no matter how far from home they are. I see other delegates already celebrating in small groups, congratulating each other on finally solving what they called the human problem. I do not join them. The human problem, as most of the Compact called it, was never really about danger. It was about pride. Humanity joined the Compact only 40 years ago, the newest and youngest species ever granted a seat, and within a single generation their ships were faster, their medicine was better, and their diplomats were sharper than species who had been part of the Compact for 1,000 years. Older species do not enjoy being outpaced by children. When a border skirmish broke out near a neutral system last year, and human ships responded to a distress call without waiting for Compact authorization, the older delegates finally had the excuse they needed. It did not matter that the humans saved 11,000 lives that day. It only mattered that they acted without permission. I remember the debate that followed. I remember delegates from species far older than Earth's civilization standing up and calling humanity reckless, arrogant, unpredictable. I remember thinking how strange it was that the species most often called unpredictable was also the species whose engineers built half the medical technology now saving lives across a dozen systems, whose explorers had mapped more unclaimed space in 4 decades than the rest of the Compact combined had mapped in 4 centuries, and whose ships had answered every single distress call ever sent their way, regardless of species, regardless of politics. I return to my quarters that night and cannot sleep. I keep thinking about the way Grace Whitmore said those 5 words. Humanity will make its rules clear. Not a threat, not an insult. A simple statement of fact, delivered the way you might tell someone the weather is about to change. By morning, the first reports start coming in. Every human embassy across Compact space has closed. Not evacuated in a hurry, not abandoned in panic, but closed, with the same quiet precision Grace Whitmore showed at the podium. Staff gone. Equipment gone. Nothing left behind but empty rooms and locked doors. Human trade ships that were scheduled to dock at a dozen different stations simply never arrive, and no distress calls follow them. They do not crash. They do not get delayed. They simply reroute somewhere else, somewhere Compact sensors cannot follow, and they do not come back. I check the news channels obsessively over the following days. Delegates from the wealthier world seem thrilled. Andrei's own trade minister sends me a message calling it a great day for fair competition, now that the humans are gone and our own shipbuilders can finally catch up. I do not answer him. I keep thinking about the hospital station near the Varan Belt that relies entirely on human-built medical scanners, the kind no other species has managed to reverse engineer despite years of trying. I keep thinking about the mining colonies along the outer rim that have no defense fleet of their own, because for as long as anyone can remember, human patrol ships quietly covered that region, chasing off raiders without ever asking for payment or recognition. Nobody voted to end that. Nobody even discussed it. We voted to punish arrogance, and in doing so, we cut away things we never bothered to notice were holding us up. A week passes, then two. The silence from Earth continues, and slowly, uneasily, the compact begins to relax. No warships appear at anyone's border. No demands arrive, no threats. The louder voices in the assembly start calling it proof that humanity was always weaker than its reputation suggested, that the so-called rules Grace Whitmore promised were nothing but an empty threat from a defeated diplomat trying to save face on her way out the door. I do not believe that, and it turns out I am right not to. The first sign comes from the outer rim, the same region I had been thinking about, the mining colonies that never had their own defenses because human patrols always handled it. A raider group hits one of the smaller colonies, something that has not happened in that sector for almost 15 years. The colony sends out a distress call on every frequency they know, including the old human emergency channel that has answered every call for decades without fail. This time, nothing answers. The colony survives, barely, thanks to a lucky arrival of an independent merchant convoy that happened to be passing through. But the message spreads fast through every channel that matters. The old human emergency frequency, the one every frontier colony memorized because it was the one guarantee of safety in a dangerous stretch of space, has gone completely silent. I request a private meeting with 3 other delegates who voted against banishment, species who understand, as I do, that something serious is unfolding. We meet in a small conference room, away from the cameras and the noise of the main chamber. One of them, a Varathi delegate named Ocean Carr, has already done the research I have only started to consider. He shows me a chart of every region across compact space that quietly depended on human infrastructure, human patrols, human medical supply chains, human early warning systems for stellar hazards. The chart is longer than I expect. It is longer than anyone in that room expected. We ask ourselves the same question. If this is only the beginning, what comes next? We do not have to wait long to find out. A research vessel from a wealthy compact member species, one of the loudest voices celebrating Earth's banishment, goes missing near what used to be a jointly patrolled border zone, a stretch of space that human ships secured for free under an old goodwill agreement nobody bothered to formally cancel when the banishment vote passed. The vessel sends one final transmission before contact is lost. A single ship is sighted nearby, its markings unmistakably human, though unarmed as far as any sensor reading can determine. Then silence. The compact sends a formal diplomatic protest. It goes to the last known human government address on file, the same address used for 40 years of correspondence. No response arrives. No confirmation the message was even received. I sit in my quarters that night, staring at the chart Ocean Carr showed me, and I finally understand what Grace Whitmore meant. Humanity is not attacking anyone. Humanity is simply stopping. Stopping the patrols nobody paid for. Stopping the emergency channels nobody thanked them for keeping open. Stopping the quiet, unpaid, unacknowledged work that held together corners of the galaxy the rest of us assumed would always just work on their own. Because it always had. Because we never once asked who was actually keeping it running. The rules Grace Whitmore promised were never a threat. They were an explanation, delivered in advance, of exactly what the galaxy was about to lose, and exactly why. We just did not understand her words until the silence started teaching us. I close my eyes that night and think about the human ambassador walking out of that chamber, with her spine straight and her chin level, already knowing everything that was coming, already knowing none of us were ready to hear it. I think about how calm she was. I think about how much worse this is going to get before anyone in that chamber admits how badly we misunderstood what we were voting to throw away. I do not sleep again that night. I do not think anyone who understands what is coming will sleep well for a long time. 3 weeks after the vote, I stop believing this will resolve itself quietly, and I start keeping a private record of everything I learn, because I sense that someday, someone will need to understand how this happened, piece by piece, before it became too large to stop. The mining colony that survived the raid on the Outer Rim sends a formal request to the Assembly, asking for emergency defense support. The request sits in committee for 6 days, before anyone even schedules a vote. I attend the session out of a growing sense of dread rather than duty. The defense minister from one of the larger member worlds stands up and explains, almost proudly, that his species is prepared to offer patrol ships to the region, for a fee, payable quarterly, with a formal treaty required before the first ship departs. The colony representative, a tired-looking man named Farid Osei who traveled 2 weeks to attend this session in person, asks how long the treaty process usually takes. The answer is 4 to 6 months. Farid Osei asks what his people are supposed to do for 4 to 6 months. Nobody has a good answer. I watch delegates shuffle papers and avoid his eyes, and I think about how easily we all forgot that human patrols never once asked for a treaty, never once asked for a fee, never once made a frightened colony administrator wait 4 to 6 months to feel safe again. I find Osin's car afterward, and we walk together through the station's long observation deck, looking out at the slow traffic of ships, docking and undocking. He tells me he has been quietly reaching out to contacts across several agricultural worlds, species that depend heavily on weather prediction satellites, human engineers built and maintained, as part of an old Goodwill program. 3 of those worlds have already reported gaps in their forecasting data. One of them just lost an entire early harvest because a storm system arrived 2 days earlier than any of their own instruments predicted, and their human-built satellite network, the one that used to catch storms like that a full week in advance, has gone completely dark. Nobody attacked that satellite network. Nobody had to. It simply stopped receiving human maintenance updates, and within weeks it began to fail in ways nobody else in the compact knows how to repair, because the technology was never fully shared, only offered as a service, quietly, generously, and now, deliberately withdrawn. I begin to understand the shape of what is happening. This is not a war. There are no explosions, no invasions, no ultimatums delivered by armed fleets. This is something far harder to fight, because there is nothing to shoot at. Humanity has simply stopped doing things for a galaxy that voted to say it did not want them around anymore, and the galaxy is only now discovering how much of its daily life depended on those things continuing without interruption. I request access to the old joint agreements humanity signed with the Compact over the years, most of which were considered minor footnotes at the time they were approved. I spend 2 full days reading through them with growing unease. There is an agreement covering deep space rescue operations, in which human ships responded to any distress signal within a certain range, regardless of the sender's species or political standing, at no cost to the colony or vessel in danger. There is an agreement covering medical technology sharing, under which human-designed diagnostic equipment was distributed to hospitals across dozens of systems at reduced cost, with human engineers providing free maintenance visits twice a year. There is an agreement covering deep space navigation beacons, an entire network humanity built and funded almost single-handedly because their ships traveled farther and faster than anyone else's and needed reliable markers no other species had gotten around to building. None of these agreements were ever formally part of the Compact Charter. They were side arrangements, goodwill gestures, the kind of quiet generosity that becomes invisible the moment it becomes routine. We built our comfort on top of them without ever writing them into the treaties that actually mattered. And now that humanity has been formally erased from Compact records, every one of those quiet arrangements has ended with it, because there was never any legal reason for them to continue. I bring this information to the Assembly's Oversight Committee, hoping someone in a position of actual power will finally take it seriously. I present the list of dependencies. I present the reports from the Outer Rim colonies and the agricultural worlds. I present the growing pattern of small, uncelebrated systems that once relied entirely on human infrastructure and are now, one by one, discovering exactly how alone they have become. The response I receive is not what I hoped for. Several committee members accuse me of exaggerating the situation to score political points against the vote I opposed. One delegate, representing a wealthy central world with no meaningful dependency on human infrastructure, tells me plainly that his people have felt no impact whatsoever, and perhaps the colonies struggling now should have invested in their own defenses, instead of relying on a species everyone always knew was unpredictable. I want to ask him how a mining colony, with a population smaller than one district of his own homeworld, was supposed to fund a defense fleet, when human patrols offered protection for free, and asked for nothing in return except the right to keep doing it. I do not ask, because I already know the answer he would give, and I do not have the patience left to hear it. That night, I receive an encrypted message from a contact I have known for years, a logistics coordinator, working out of one of the larger trade hubs near the Compact's western border. She tells me that 3 separate supply convoys have failed to arrive on schedule over the past week, all of them carrying medical shipments that were, until recently, transported through routes secured by human escort ships. Without those escorts, insurance costs for the shipping companies have tripled overnight, and 2 of the smaller companies have already suspended operations on that route entirely, rather than risk their vessels without protection. I ask her what happens to the medical shipments now stuck in warehouses, instead of reaching the hospitals that ordered them. She tells me she does not know, and that is the part of her message that stays with me longest. Not the numbers, not the costs, but the simple fact that a logistics coordinator, with 2 decades of experience, someone whose entire career is built on knowing where things go and how they get there, genuinely does not know what happens next. I think about Grace Whitmore again, about the calm way she delivered 5 words that nobody in that chamber understood as anything more than a diplomat's final gesture of dignity. I think about how wrong we were to hear those words as a threat, when they were, in fact, the only warning we were ever going to get. I begin drafting a private report, intended not for the Assembly, which I no longer trust to act on anything that does not immediately threaten the comfort of its wealthiest members, but for any colony administrator, hospital director, or logistics coordinator willing to listen. I list every dependency I can find. I list every quiet human contribution the Compact has taken for granted for decades. I do not know yet whether anyone will read it, or whether it will make any difference at all, but I write it anyway, because someone has to keep an honest record of what we are losing, one silent withdrawal at a time. 2 more weeks pass. The gaps grow wider. The mining colony on the outer rim, still waiting for its treaty to clear committee, reports a second raid, smaller this time, but enough to remind everyone that the old safety net is truly gone, and nothing has yet replaced it. The agricultural worlds report a second mist storm warning, though this time the losses are smaller, because desperate engineers have started cobbling together makeshift forecasting systems from whatever old equipment they can find. And through it all, humanity says nothing. No statements, no demands. No warnings beyond the 5 words Grace Whitmore spoke on her way out of the chamber. The silence itself has become the loudest thing in compact space, and I am beginning to suspect that this silence is not an accident, but a lesson, delivered patiently, precisely, to a galaxy that has never once had to learn what its own comfort actually cost. A month after the vote, the word rule finally starts meaning something specific, rather than a vague dread hanging over every report I read. It arrives not through any official channel, but through a discovery so strange that it takes 3 separate confirmations before anyone believes it is real. A salvage crew working a debris field near a neutral system, far from any compact patrol route, comes across a drifting vessel with no power signature and no crew aboard. The ship is old, poorly maintained, clearly not a compact registered vessel. Records eventually identify it as a raider ship, one of several that have been harassing independent traders in that region for years, always slipping away before any authority could catch them. This time, the ship is simply dead in space, completely intact, with every system shut down and no sign of a struggle. Inside, salvage crews find something nobody expects. Scratched into the metal wall near the command console, in careful, deliberate letters, is a message. It is not signed. It does not need to be. The message states plainly that any vessel operating within what used to be the human-defended perimeter around Old Sol space, and by extension any raider preying on colonies that once fell under quiet human protection, will no longer be tolerated, warned, or given a second encounter. The message spreads across every trade network within days. I read it for myself, forwarded to me by Oseen Carr, with no additional comment needed. The wording is calm. There is no threat of violence written anywhere in it. No description of what happened to the raider crew. No claim of responsibility. It simply states a boundary and a consequence. The same quiet, precise tone Grace Whitmore used when she stood at that podium and told an entire assembly that humanity would make its rules clear. Within a week, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Raiders who have operated freely in border regions for years, regions that fell just outside official compact jurisdiction, but well within the informal reach of old human patrols, begin vanishing. Not all of them. Not violently, as far as anyone can determine, since no wreckage is ever found, and no distress signals are ever recorded. They simply stop appearing. Ships that were tracked moving toward vulnerable colonies change course and are never seen again. Communication chatter between known raider groups, chatter that compact intelligence services have monitored for years, goes silent in entire sectors, one after another. I request a meeting with an intelligence analyst I have worked with before, a careful, skeptical woman named Nyla Farrow, who has never once exaggerated a report in the years I have known her. She tells me, with visible discomfort, that her department has identified at least 11 separate raider vessels that simply stopped existing in any tracked capacity over the past 2 weeks, all of them operating in regions that used to fall under informal human protection. She tells me her department has no evidence of any confrontation, no evidence of any battle, nothing beyond the simple, unsettling fact that ships known to prey on the weak have quietly ceased to be a problem, in a way that only ever happened before when human patrols were actively working that region. I ask her what her department believes is happening. She hesitates before answering, and when she finally speaks, her voice is quieter than I have ever heard it. She tells me her working theory, one she is reluctant to put in any official report because it sounds too much like fear rather than analysis, is that humanity never actually left. They simply stopped being visible, stopped announcing themselves, stopped operating under the polite, transparent rules of engagement that came with compact membership. And without those rules constraining them, whatever they are doing now to protect the space they still consider worth protecting is happening entirely outside anyone's ability to observe, question, or stop it. The thought unsettles me more than any battle report could. For 40 years, humanity operated within compact law, submitting to inspections, filing reports, accepting oversight from an assembly that, in the end, voted to erase them anyway. Now, freed from every obligation that assembly ever placed on them, they are choosing, quietly and without any announcement, exactly which parts of the galaxy still deserve their protection, and exactly which parts do not. I think about the second rule, if that is truly what it is, the one written not in a formal treaty but scratched into the hull of a dead raider ship. It tells me something important about how humanity intends to operate now. They are not punishing the compact as a whole. They are not attacking anyone who has not attacked someone else first. They are simply enforcing a boundary they used to enforce quietly and generously, except now, that boundary comes without warning, without negotiation, and without the transparency the compact always assumed it was entitled to. A research vessel from a wealthy central world, the same species whose delegate dismissed my concerns in committee only weeks earlier, strays into the edge of what used to be charted human space while conducting an unrelated survey mission. The crew reports nothing unusual for the first 2 days. On the third day, all contact ends mid-transmission, with no distress call, no warning, no final message. A single vessel, unarmed as far as any sensor reading before the loss of contact could determine, is noted in the ship's last transmitted sensor sweep, close enough to be visible, far enough to avoid any clear identification. After that, nothing. The compact sends a formal protest through the same unanswered address used for every previous complaint. This time, 3 days later, something unusual happens. A response arrives, brief, unsigned, delivered through a relay signal that compact engineers cannot trace back to any registered human server. It contains a single line: trespassing, in what remains ours, carries a cost we no longer explain in advance. The Assembly convenes an emergency session! I attend, along with every delegate who has spent the past month quietly documenting the growing pattern of dependency and loss across a dozen different regions. For the first time since the vote, the mood in the chamber is not one of triumph or indifference. It is something closer to fear, though nobody uses that word out loud. Delegates who once celebrated humanity's removal now demand answers about what happened to the missing research vessel, as if the compact still has any authority to demand anything from a species it formally erased from every record less than 2 months ago. I stand and remind the chamber, as calmly as I can manage, that we surrendered our right to demand explanations the moment we voted to end every treaty that gave us standing to ask. The room does not want to hear this. Several delegates shout over me, insisting the missing vessel represents an act of open hostility that demands a unified response. I ask them what response they propose, given that nobody has managed to locate a single human warship, a single human colony, a single fixed location, anywhere that a response could even be directed toward. Nobody has an answer. The session ends without any resolution, and I leave the chamber more certain than ever that we are no longer dealing with a species reacting to a single unfair vote. We are dealing with a species that has spent decades quietly mapping every weakness the rest of us never bothered to notice in ourselves, and is now, deliberately and without apology, showing us exactly how much of our safety, our stability, and our comfort was never truly ours to begin with. That night, I finally understand what Grace Whitmore meant when she promised rules rather than threats. A threat implies negotiation, implies room for the other side to change course and avoid consequences. A rule implies something far more permanent. A rule simply exists, indifferent to whether anyone agrees with it, indifferent to whether anyone even acknowledges it exists at all, until the moment someone breaks it and discovers, often too late, exactly how firm it truly was. 6 weeks after the vote, I stop thinking of this as a diplomatic crisis and start thinking of it as something closer to a slow collapse, one that nobody in power seems willing to name honestly, even as the evidence piles higher every single day. The missing research vessel is never found. The wealthy central world that lost it demands answers for 2 full weeks before quietly dropping the matter, once its own intelligence services conclude, privately, that pursuing the question further risks losing more than a single ship. I learn this from Nyla Farrow, who tells me the shift in tone happened almost overnight, once certain officials realized that whatever humanity built to enforce that unmarked border was capable of erasing a fully crewed survey vessel without leaving behind a single trace for anyone to investigate. Meanwhile, the smaller failures keep multiplying, each one unremarkable on its own, each one part of a pattern too large for anyone to deny any longer. A hospital station near the Varan Belt, the one I thought about on the very first night after the vote, finally runs into the crisis I feared from the beginning. 3 of its human-built diagnostic scanners fail within the same week, machines that have operated without serious fault for over a decade, thanks to biannual maintenance visits from human engineers who never once charged the station more than a token fee for their time. With no replacement parts available anywhere in compact markets, and no engineers trained to repair technology nobody else fully understands, the station is forced to fall back on older, far less capable equipment. A doctor there, a soft-spoken man named Peter Langley who has spent 30 years treating patients from a dozen different species, sends a message that spreads quickly through medical networks across the compact. He does not blame humanity for withdrawing support they were never obligated to provide. He simply states, plainly and without anger, that 3 patients died last week, from conditions his old equipment failed to catch in time, conditions the newer scanners would have identified in minutes. I read his message twice, then a third time, and I think about how easily the Assembly dismissed similar warnings only weeks earlier as exaggeration. The agricultural worlds fare no better. The makeshift forecasting systems engineers cobbled together prove unreliable during a second major storm season, and 2 more worlds report significant crop losses, this time large enough to trigger formal requests for emergency food aid from wealthier compact members. Those requests move through committee at the same painfully slow pace as the Outer Rim Colony's defense request months earlier, and I begin to suspect that the compact's bureaucracy, built for a galaxy that assumed humanity would always quietly smooth over its inefficiencies, was never actually designed to function without that invisible support. I bring my growing report to a wider audience this time, no longer trusting the Assembly's Oversight Committee to act with any urgency. I share it directly with colony administrators, independent journalists, and logistics coordinators across a dozen systems, Anyone willing to read an honest account of exactly how deep the compact's dependency on humanity truly ran. The response surprises me. Within days, the report is being shared, translated, and discussed across trade networks, far beyond anything I expected. For the first time since the vote, ordinary people across the compact, not just delegates and diplomats, begin asking the question I have been asking myself for weeks. What exactly did we vote to lose? And why did none of us understand it until it was already gone? The Assembly, sensing the shifting mood among its own citizens, finally organizes a formal investigation into the full scope of human infrastructure dependency across compact space. I am asked to testify, given the report I have already compiled, and I agree, though I have little faith the investigation will move quickly enough to matter. My testimony lasts nearly 3 hours. I walk the committee through every quiet agreement I found, every uncelebrated patrol route, every free maintenance visit, every emergency channel that used to answer without fail, and now answers with nothing at all. I present numbers wherever I have them, and honest uncertainty wherever I do not. I tell them, as clearly as I can, that humanity never once asked for recognition for any of this work while they were still members of the Compact, and that perhaps that quiet generosity is exactly why so few of us ever understood how much we depended on it until it stopped. One delegate, a sharp-voiced woman from a mid-sized trade world named Clara Whitfield, asks me directly whether I believe humanity intends to negotiate a return to the Compact, given enough time and enough pressure from the growing list of dependent worlds. I tell her honestly that I do not know, but that everything I have observed over the past 6 weeks suggests humanity is not waiting anxiously for an invitation back. They are, instead, quietly redefining what kind of relationship they are willing to have with a galaxy that voted, with very little debate, to treat decades of quiet generosity as grounds for banishment the moment it became politically convenient to do so. Clara Whitfield does not like my answer, but she does not argue with it either, and something in her expression tells me she already suspects I am right. After the testimony, I am approached by a young aide working for one of the wealthier delegations, a nervous man named Ibrahim Coles who asks to speak with me privately. He tells me his delegation has been quietly attempting to reach any human contact for the past 3 weeks, through every back channel and informal connection they still maintain from decades of trade relationships, hoping to negotiate some kind of private arrangement that would restore at least partial access to human medical technology and defense support, separate from whatever the full assembly eventually decides. I ask him what response, if any, his delegation has received. He tells me, quietly, that every single attempt has returned the same result. Silence, followed eventually by a brief, unsigned message stating that private arrangements outside the framework humanity is still finalizing will not be considered, and that any further attempts to bypass that framework will be treated the same way the trespassing research vessel was treated. I ask him what framework he means. He tells me nobody knows yet. Humanity has said only that new terms are coming, delivered on their own schedule, to the Assembly as a whole, and not to any individual delegation seeking to gain an advantage over its neighbors by negotiating privately first. I leave that conversation with a strange, unfamiliar feeling settling over me, something between dread and a reluctant kind of respect. For decades, the Compact operated on the assumption that humanity, as the newest and least experienced member, would always be the one adapting to older, more established customs and expectations. Now, for the first time, I understand that humanity has spent this entire crisis quietly proving the opposite is true, and that whatever framework they eventually deliver will be built entirely on their own terms, whether the rest of us are ready for it or not. That night, reports arrive from 3 separate systems simultaneously, each describing the same strange event. A single human warship, unannounced and unescorted, has been sighted at the far edge of compact space, holding perfectly still at the boundary between charted territory and the vast unclaimed region beyond it. It makes no attempt to enter compact space. It sends no communication. It simply sits there, visible to every long-range sensor array within reach, as if waiting for something, or perhaps as if allowing itself, finally, to be seen. I stare at the sensor images for a long time before I finally understand what I am looking at. This is not an invasion. This is not the beginning of a war. This is a single ship, deliberately placed where every frightened, uncertain member of the compact can see it clearly, delivered at exactly the moment the assembly finally agreed to investigate what it lost, as if humanity has been watching this entire slow, painful realization unfold, and has decided, at last, that it is time for the next part of their message to begin. The warship does not move for 3 full days, and in that time, I watch the compact do something I never expected to witness. I watch it begin, quietly and painfully, to admit it made a mistake. The sighting spreads faster than any official channel can manage. Every independent news network across compact space carries the same sensor image, a single vessel, sleek and unremarkable in size, compared to the great battle cruisers the compact's largest members maintain, sitting motionless at the boundary of charted space. Analysts argue for hours about what kind of weapons systems it might carry, what its presence might mean, whether it represents the opening move of a war nobody quite believes humanity actually wants. I do not join those arguments. I already suspect the ship is not there to fight. I suspect it is there to be looked at, the same way Grace Whitmore stood at that podium and made sure every delegate in the chamber looked directly at her when she spoke her final 5 words. The Assembly's emergency investigation, the one I testified before only days earlier, moves with unusual speed, now that a warship sits visible at the edge of every long-range sensor array in compact space. Delegates who spent weeks dismissing my report as exaggeration now demand immediate answers about the full scope of human infrastructure dependency, as if the information has only just become real to them now that it arrives alongside a ship they can actually see. Clara Whitfield, the sharp-voiced delegate who questioned my testimony, requests a private meeting with me. I agree, curious what she wants after weeks of open skepticism toward everything I presented. She tells me her delegation has finally admitted, internally, that at least a third of their trade routes depended on human escort ships they never paid for, and rarely acknowledged, and that losing those routes has already cost her world more in 6 weeks than the entire defense budget increase they celebrated after the banishment vote passed. She does not apologize for her earlier skepticism. She simply asks me, quietly, what I believe humanity actually wants now. I tell her, I do not think humanity wants anything from the compact in the way we usually understand that word. I do not think they want an apology, though one might eventually be offered. I do not think they want reinstatement under the old terms, since nothing about their recent behavior suggests any interest in returning to a relationship where they carried enormous responsibility while receiving little recognition, and, in the end, a banishment vote as their reward. I tell her I believe they want something closer to acknowledgement, a full and honest reckoning with exactly what the compact lost and exactly why, before anyone discusses what comes next. Clara Whitfield does not respond right away. When she finally speaks, she tells me she hopes I am right, because the alternative, a humanity that wants something closer to control rather than acknowledgement, terrifies her far more than a single motionless warship ever could. On the 4th day, the Assembly receives a formal communication, the first genuine diplomatic contact from any human source since the banishment vote passed nearly 7 weeks earlier. It does not come through the old, unanswered address used for every previous protest. It arrives through a new channel, established specifically for this single transmission, delivered directly to the Speaker's office, with instructions that it be read aloud to the full Assembly before any private discussion takes place. I attend the session that follows, along with every delegate the station can hold, plus thousands more watching remotely from across compact space. The Speaker, visibly uncomfortable, opens the transmission and begins to read. The message identifies its sender simply as a representative of the human government, without naming a specific individual, which strikes me immediately as deliberate, a signal that whatever comes next speaks for humanity as a whole, rather than for any single ambassador who might once again be dismissed as merely one voice among many. The message begins by acknowledging the banishment vote plainly, without bitterness, as a decision the compact was entitled to make under its own charter. It states that humanity does not dispute the Assembly's right to determine its own membership, and that no formal grievance is being filed regarding the vote itself. I feel the tension in the chamber shift slightly at this, a cautious, hopeful murmur passing through delegates who perhaps expected something closer to an ultimatum. The message continues, and the tone changes. It states that for 40 years, humanity provided defense, medical support, navigation infrastructure, and emergency response services across dozens of compact systems, largely without formal compensation, without public acknowledgement, and without any requirement that it continue beyond what humanity itself chose to offer. It states that this generosity was never a condition of compact membership, was never written into any treaty that obligated its continuation, and was therefore always subject to change at humanity's own discretion, the same discretion the Assembly exercised when it voted to end humanity's membership without warning or negotiation. It states, plainly, that humanity has chosen to exercise that same discretion now. The chamber is utterly silent as the speaker continues reading. The message describes, in careful detail, exactly what humanity intends going forward. All previously informal arrangements, the free patrols, the discounted medical technology, the unpaid maintenance visits, the open emergency channels, are formally and permanently ended. Any future access to human technology, human defense support, or human assistance of any kind will require a new formal agreement, negotiated directly with the full assembly, built on terms humanity itself will propose, rather than terms requested by individual member worlds seeking special treatment. The message states that these terms will be delivered within one full rotation of humanity's home star, an old-fashioned way of measuring time that I suspect is entirely deliberate. A final quiet reminder that humanity intends to operate on its own calendar now, not the compact's. Finally, the message states that the warship currently visible at the boundary of compact space is not a threat and will take no hostile action against any vessel that does not attempt to cross into space. Humanity still considers its own to protect. It is present, the message states, simply as confirmation that humanity has not vanished, has not been destroyed, and has not been diminished by the vote that removed it from the compact. It remains, fully capable, fully aware of everything the compact has lost in the weeks since, and fully prepared to explain, in detail and without further silence, exactly what comes next. The speaker finishes reading, and for a long moment, nobody in the chamber says anything at all. I look around at delegates who spent weeks insisting humanity's departure would barely be noticed, now sitting in complete silence, finally confronted with the plain, unemotional truth of everything they chose to dismiss. Clara Whitfield, sitting several rows away from me, catches my eye briefly and gives a small, tired nod, as if to say she understands now, fully, what I tried to tell her weeks earlier. I nod back, though I feel no satisfaction in being right. I only feel the same cold weight I felt the night of the original vote, except now it is shared by an entire chamber that finally understands exactly what it lost, and exactly how long it will take to learn whether humanity is willing to let any of it be rebuilt. The assembly spends the following days in a state I have never witnessed in 11 years of service, something close to genuine humility, though I know better than to expect it will last once the immediate shock fades. Delegates who once celebrated humanity's removal now quietly ask each other how the compact ever allowed itself to depend so completely on a single member species, without ever formally acknowledging the arrangement, let alone protecting it. I am asked to join a small working group tasked with preparing the Assembly's official response to the human message, given my early involvement in documenting the scope of the crisis. Oseen Carr joins as well, along with Clara Whitfield, whose skepticism has fully given way to something closer to urgency, now that her own world's losses have become impossible to ignore. Nayla Farrow provides intelligence briefings, though she admits, honestly, that her department still has almost no reliable information about humanity's current military capability, defense infrastructure, or internal political situation, a gap in knowledge that unsettles her more than any of the numbers in my original report. We spend 2 full days simply trying to determine what the Assembly should even say in response, given that humanity has already stated plainly that formal terms are coming regardless of anything the compact offers first. Clara Whitfield argues that the Assembly should draft a preemptive apology, hoping to soften whatever terms humanity eventually proposes. Oseen Carr disagrees, pointing out that an apology delivered only after the consequences became painful enough to force it would likely be received as insincere, motivated by self-interest, rather than genuine reflection. I find myself agreeing with him, though I understand Clara Whitfield's instinct. Fear makes people want to say something, anything, rather than simply wait. In the end, the working group recommends, and the Assembly narrowly approves, a brief formal response acknowledging receipt of humanity's message, confirming the Compact's willingness to negotiate new terms in good faith, and requesting only that humanity clarify, ahead of the full proposal, whether any immediate humanitarian exceptions might be considered for colonies and hospitals currently facing severe hardship as a direct result of the transition. I helped draft this final request myself, thinking of Peter Langley and the hospital station near the Varan Belt, of Farid Osei, and the mining colony still waiting for a defense treaty that may never matter now. The response is sent. 4 days pass without any reply, and I begin to worry that humanity has already decided the Assembly's message was inadequate, too little, delivered too late. On the 5th day, a reply finally arrives, shorter than the original message, but far more consequential than its brevity suggests. It states that humanity has reviewed the Assembly's request, and while the formal framework for renewed cooperation remains under final preparation, an immediate, limited humanitarian exception will be authorized. Human medical support teams will resume service to a specific list of hospital stations currently experiencing the most severe equipment failures, including the station near the Varan Belt, effective within 72 hours. The message states plainly that this exception is not a resumption of the Compact's former membership benefits, and should not be interpreted as a signal that humanity intends to return to its previous role without new terms firmly in place. It is offered, the message states, because humanity does not believe patients should suffer for a political decision they had no part in making, regardless of how that decision affects the relationship between their government and the wider Compact. I read this line several times, feeling something unexpected loosen in my chest, for the first time in weeks. Even now, even after everything, humanity draws a clear line between punishing the systems that failed them and abandoning the people caught inside those systems. It is, I think, exactly the kind of distinction the Assembly itself never bothered to make when it voted to banish an entire species over the actions of a single unauthorized rescue mission. Word of the humanitarian exception spreads quickly, and for the first time since the vote, I see something like hope moving through the stations and colonies that have suffered most over the past 7 weeks. Peter Langley sends a brief message through the medical network I have been quietly monitoring, simply stating that a human engineering team has already made contact and expects to have the station's primary scanner operational again within days. He does not comment on the politics of the situation. He simply says, plainly, that he is grateful, and that gratitude, more than anything the Assembly could draft, feels like the first honest word spoken in this entire crisis. The mining colony on the Outer Rim receives no similar exception, since its danger comes from raiders rather than failing infrastructure. But Farid Osei sends word that the region has, strangely, grown quieter since the warship first appeared at the Compact border. Whatever presence humanity maintains beyond the reach of Compact sensors, it seems to be enough, for now, to keep the raiders cautious, even without a formal treaty in place. I bring these updates back to the working group, and for the first time, the mood among us shifts from anxious uncertainty to something closer to careful optimism. Osin Carr points out, correctly, that humanity's willingness to offer even a limited exception suggests they are not interested in punishing the Compact indefinitely, only in ensuring that whatever relationship comes next is built on honest terms rather than quiet, unacknowledged generosity that can be dismissed the moment it becomes politically convenient. Clara Whitfield asks the question I know has been sitting in the back of everyone's mind since the humanitarian exception arrived. She asks whether the Assembly, when the full terms finally arrive, will actually be willing to accept them, whatever they turn out to be, or whether pride will once again override the lessons this crisis has spent 7 long weeks trying to teach us. Nobody in the room has a confident answer, and I realize, sitting there among delegates who genuinely want to do better this time, that the hardest part of this entire ordeal may still be ahead of us. It is one thing to recognize a mistake once its consequences become undeniable. It is another thing entirely to accept whatever price is required to repair it, especially when that price is set not by the Compact's own comfortable assumptions, but by a species that has finally, patiently, made its rules clear enough that nobody can pretend to misunderstand them any longer. One full rotation of humanity's home star, as they measure it, comes to exactly 365 days by their own reckoning, though the terms arrive far sooner than that. Delivered instead on what I later learn is a date humanity considers significant for reasons entirely their own. A small detail that tells me they never intended to wait the full year, only to give themselves however long they actually needed, on their own schedule, exactly as promised. The formal terms arrive 9 weeks after the original vote, delivered once again through the Speaker's office, and once again read aloud to the full assembly before any private discussion begins. I attend, seated beside Oseen Carr and Clara Whitfield, all three of us quieter than usual, aware that whatever is read today will shape the next chapter of the Compact's history, far more than the original banishment vote ever could. The terms are precise, and unlike the quiet generosity of the old arrangements, they leave no room for ambiguity. Humanity proposes a new formal treaty, separate entirely from Compact membership, under which defense support, medical technology, and navigation infrastructure will be provided only under specific, individually negotiated agreements, each one requiring fair payment, mutual obligation, and clear terms of renewal or termination, reviewed regularly by both parties, rather than assumed indefinitely by one. No more quiet favors extended without acknowledgement. No more informal patrols treated as an unspoken given. No more assumption that generosity, once offered, must continue forever without question or gratitude. The terms state plainly that humanity does not seek reinstatement to the Compact Assembly, and does not request a vote to reverse the banishment. They state that humanity has concluded, after careful reflection, that a formal seat within an assembly capable of erasing an entire species from every record over a single contested incident, without meaningful debate or warning, is not a relationship worth restoring on the same terms as before. Instead, they propose something new, a direct treaty between two sovereign parties, negotiated as equals, honored, not because either side depends on the other's goodwill, but because both sides have finally agreed, in writing, exactly what each owes the other, and exactly what happens if those obligations are ever broken again. The chamber is silent as the speaker finishes reading. I watch delegates who spent weeks hoping for a full return to the old arrangement, absorb the reality that humanity is offering something far more limited, and far more honest, than anyone expected. There will be no return to a compact that quietly benefits from human generosity, while reserving the right to discard it whenever convenient. There will only be a treaty, built on mutual respect rather than assumption, available to any world willing to negotiate its terms fairly. I am asked, along with the rest of the original working group, to help draft the Assembly's formal response accepting the framework, and in the weeks that follow, I watch individual worlds begin the slow, careful process of negotiating their own agreements under the new terms. The hospital station near the Varan Belt secures a maintenance contract within days, modest in cost but reliable in a way the old informal arrangement, generous as it was, never legally guaranteed. The mining colony on the outer rim finally secures a defense agreement of its own, not free as the old patrols once were, but fair, transparent, and most importantly, certain, backed by a written commitment neither side can simply erase with a single vote. I meet Grace Whitmore again, months later, at the signing of the Compact's own formal treaty with humanity's government, the broad agreement that establishes the framework under which all the smaller individual treaties will operate going forward. She looks exactly as calm as she did the day she walked out of the chamber, and when our eyes meet across the room, I see something I did not expect. Not triumph, not resentment, only a quiet, tired satisfaction. The look of someone who did something difficult because it needed doing, not because it brought her any pleasure. I approach her after the signing, and ask the question I have carried since the very first night after the vote. I ask her whether she knew, standing at that podium with the assembly already moving on to its next agenda item, exactly how this would unfold, exactly how much the compact would lose before it finally understood what it had thrown away. She tells me she did not know the details, could not have predicted every hospital scanner or every missing storm forecast, but she knew, with complete certainty, that a galaxy which never bothered to understand what it depended on would eventually be forced to learn the hard way. And that humanity's task, once the vote passed, was simply to make sure that lesson was taught honestly, without exaggeration, without cruelty, but also without the quiet dishonesty of pretending the old arrangement could simply continue unchanged after the compact chose to end it. I ask her whether she believes the new treaty will hold, whether the compact has truly learned enough to honor terms built on equal footing rather than quiet, one-sided generosity. She tells me she does not know that either, not yet, but that humanity is no longer willing to operate any other way, regardless of how the compact chooses to respond going forward. If the treaty holds, both sides benefit fairly. If it does not, humanity has already proven, clearly and without ambiguity, exactly what happens to those who take its generosity for granted. I think about this conversation often in the months that follow, as I return to my duties in an assembly forever changed by the crisis it brought upon itself. I think about how easily generosity, offered freely and without demand, can become invisible to those who receive it, mistaken for something owed rather than something given. I think about Farid Osei's mining colony, finally safe under fair terms rather than quiet charity, and Peter Langley's hospital station, finally supported by a contract rather than an assumption. I think about the single warship that once sat motionless at the edge of compact space, not as a threat, but as a patient, unwavering reminder that some lessons cannot be taught through words alone, only through the quiet, undeniable weight of what is lost when generosity finally, deliberately, stops. The vote to banish Earth was approved with very little debate, and for a short while, the compact believed it had solved a problem it barely understood. Then humanity made its rules clear, not through anger, not through violence, but through the simple, devastating clarity of stepping back and letting an entire galaxy finally see, for the first time, exactly how much it had never bothered to notice was holding it up.